Perhaps it is the sign of the times that many of us feel so disconnected from our elected leaders. As new technology seems to be advancing the human race faster than we can keep up, the mainstream media appears to be lagging behind. Today's so-called revelations may really be old news. Questions plague our souls. Why does up now appear down? And why is what was once right condemned by so many? The three hosts of this show certainly do not have all the answers, but they do have questions. Questions that you, your family, and your friends may be asking every day. Welcome to What in the World is Going On? November 22nd, 1963. A nation is shocked by the news that its president has been shot in Dallas, Texas. Within hours of the initial reports comes a slew of newscasts using words and phrases we thought we'd never hear. Here it is. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Time, some 38 minutes ago. That weekend was a nightmare, as one revelation after another found its way into our homes on the radio and through TV. Then suddenly, and without warning, the entire nation watches the only suspect in the assassination get gunned down right in front of our eyes. What just happened? Was there a coup to overthrow our government? Has the whole world gone mad? Little did we know that this story would never go away. There were too many questions, even from a nation that at that point in time believed most everything it heard from their government. Things didn't add up, and there was a sense for many that November 22nd, 1963 would forever mark the end of a nation's innocence. And with that introduction, our special guest this hour will be Robert Morningstar, a top JFK researcher, author, and a computer systems and imaging specialist. Hi, I'm Ed Galloway, and after the interview, we'll be joined by Mary London and Jack Daniel. We'll have a little roundtable discussion and talk about what we've heard. Robert Morningstar has a degree from Fordham University in psychology, and he now lives in New York City. Robert has studied the assassination of John F. Kennedy since the day it occurred, and he was the first to explore the alteration of the Zapruder film. He also says that the Warren Commission altered the evidence and suppressed the real truth behind the assassination. And now join us for part one of our interview with Robert Morningstar. Robert, first of all, thanks for being with us. And let's start by going back to 1963 and asking this question. What was the political climate like then? Were we as divided as we are now?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that background information helps people understand really the significance of November 22nd, 1963. Yes, the nation was very divided along communist, anti-communist lines, and President Kennedy and his State Department had moved so radically, so quickly and radically in their view, that they saw him as surrendering to communism and possibly a communist plant. Some of the things, and I'll tell you honestly, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev saved the world from nuclear holocaust. More on the side of President Kennedy, but Premier Khrushchev had been, he'd been on the other side of the gun as well. So between the two of them, they saved the world, and in the aftermath, they were both mortified because they realized that they had lost control of the situation, and only through the restraint of President Kennedy was a nuclear war averted, because Premier Khrushchev had delegated authority to use nuclear weapons to his on-field commander in Cuba. And he had told him, if you see a fleet, a U.S. Navy fleet, landing troops in Cuba, you're to use the Luna tactical missile, nuclear missile, and destroy that fleet. That's what the Joint Chiefs of Staff were walking into. And they were demanding that Kennedy do that. And Kennedy held his center. It's a very, very moving story of that moment.
Can you tell that story, Robert? Because I heard you tell that story before, and I think it sheds new light on the role and the character of Robert Kennedy.
Exactly so. This information comes from the Christic Institute. Daniel Sheehan was able to get the documents of the ex-com meeting at which this was discussed. And General Curtis LeMay and General Powers, his adjutant, along with the other military leaders, save the Navy, were really hot to get into it with the Russians and really finish, as they saw it, finish the job once and for all. These were veterans of Korea and World War II. The biggest hawk was General Curtis LeMay, who was actually trying to incite an attack from Russia in the middle of the crisis, with the country at DEFCON 4, which is one step before the nuclear exchange. General LeMay launched 2 ICBMs from Vandenberg Air Force Base across the Pacific in what he called missile tests, and did not tell President Kennedy or the Joint Chiefs of Staff that he was doing that. Of course, Kennedy saw what it was, and he went ballistic. They insisted that when the ships, see, their line of demarcation had been drawn across the water with this convoy of Russian ships carrying missiles and troops in their holds for Cuba.
Right.
And they had been told that if you cross this line, it will be an act of war. They sent that message to Khrushchev. The ships actually crossed the line, and Kennedy said, no, let's not do it yet. They said, they crossed the line, you've got to do it, you lose face, you said you'd do it. And he said, hold on a second, I'm not going to walk into nuclear war. And he said, Mr. Kennedy, President Kennedy, we can strike Russia and reduce it to a burning heap of radioactive rubble for 300 years.
Oh, my God.
And he couldn't believe his ears when he heard that. He was in such shock that he fell. He was in his seat, but he sank into his seat, and he began to weep. And after a few seconds, he gained his composure, and he said, no, gentlemen, I will not be the first man to unleash nuclear holocaust upon mankind. And then Robert Kennedy stood up and really dressed them down. He yelled at them, you are not going to make my brother the next Tojo. Right?
Yeah.
So Tojo was the warlord who attacked Pearl Harbor.
Right. And
he went on to say, if we were to do this now, we would be no better than the Japanese at Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
And that stood them down. So that was the climactic moment, which has never been told or depicted, even in the movie 13 Days, which was an excellent telling of the chronicle of the event.
Robert, until I heard you do this, and I heard an interview you did just to get a little refresher course and be able to talk to you a little more intelligently, I listened to an interview you did in 2009, and that's the first time that I've ever heard that story before.
Yes, it's a story that's been quashed by the media, but I am fortunate enough to be in touch with many great researchers, investigators, radio announcers, hosts like you, who give time to seeking the truth. And around 1997, I heard Daniel Sheehan on WBAI, an interview with Dr. Gary Null, tell this story and read from these documents. And I've always held that story very close to my heart because it's a very odd thing, the parallels between President Kennedy and other historic figures who have sacrificed their lives for a greater cause.
Yeah.
That's a very important one. I think the most important one. Gentlemen, I will not be the first man in human history to unleash nuclear holocaust upon mankind.
Thank God.
Gentlemen, you are not going to turn my brother into Tojo. If we were to do this, we would be no better than the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. Let those words live on.
Yeah.
Now, after this happened, President Kennedy, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, found out that the communique that they had sent to Khrushchev about the line in the water and the ultimatum had taken so long to translate, to transmit, to encode, to decode, and to translate from English into Russian. It had not gotten there in time. And it's, ironically, this is like the Battle of New Orleans. This would have been like the Battle of New Orleans. People don't understand that the Battle of New Orleans, as great a victory as it was, occurred 2 days or 3 days after the armistice with England.
After the war,
So this would have been a Battle of New Orleans with nuclear weapons, and there would have been no victor.
No.
So in the aftermath, both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, having come so close to the brink of cataclysm through error, they began to communicate through the hotline. The hotline was installed, and Kennedy and Khrushchev began to communicate. And one of the overriding issues and concerns in President Kennedy's mind was the prospect of accidental nuclear war. And one of the reasons for this was the misinterpretation of fast-moving objects that were seen regularly to be coming in from the North Polar regions and entering Canadian airspace heading for the United States. And we interpreted those very often as possible Russian nuclear attacks on our homeland. But these objects, which became called fast walkers, they moved so fast. And the code word for them was called fast walkers. So when the fast walkers came down, they were first regarded as possible attack from Russia, ICBMs. And then they would see the object stop, change direction, reverse course, and disappear. And so President Kennedy was aware that there was some other element in the air, and he saw the secrecy in a military-industrial complex, which was named by President Eisenhower, labeled by President Eisenhower in his farewell address. He saw this secrecy as a threat to world peace through accidental nuclear war. So he demanded from the Director of Central Intelligence a complete review and reclassification of all unknowns. And what unknowns meant was UFOs, unidentified flying objects that were being tracked in North American airspace, but whose origins no one knew because of this vast secrecy, with it compartmentalized secrecy in the U.S. government. We didn't know what was CIA, what was Navy, what was Army, and what was Air Force. We did know, to some extent, what was Russian, but nobody shared the information. And President Kennedy felt that we had to really actually take a census, is what he wanted. He wanted a census of all of this aerospace aerial activity over North America, so that we would not make a mistake by mistaking a UFO for an ICBM and launch a counterattack on Russia.
So Robert, was this when President Kennedy was actually kind of demanding that everything UFO related be put on his desk?
Exactly. This is the memo stating that he wanted a white paper with the reclassification of all these secret projects, so that we would know what were ours, what were our military, U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, what were Russians or other terrestrial space powers, let's say, people who were trying to get up into space, sometimes piggybacking along with us. And then what was left over was unknowns, real unknowns. I discovered a remarkable JFK doodle that came out of the JFK Library in Boston, around 1998. And it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. It's actually a drawing sketched by President Kennedy. And it has a drawing of the world. And it has all these ovals, many, many ovals over the Earth. And in the next section, it has the ovals, but some of them have dollar signs in them, and others are blank. And in the next one, there's a drawing of the moon and a drawing of the Earth. And then from the Earth, he draws a line into space, and there are 4 boxes, S1, S2, S3, S4, and then the line goes to the moon, and then it comes back to Earth. And I have to tell you that that doodle is so revealing, because he's got the little man on the moon. You know, he draws a little man, draws the Earth, draws the trajectory, the 4 boxes, S1, S2, S3, S4. The line continues around the moon and back to Earth. And Earth is being overflown by these ovals, right? That in the first sketch of the Earth, they're all blank ovals, like eggs over the Earth. And in the second drawing, he has put dollar signs on some of them. So I have the privilege of having studied Chinese written language since 1973, and that ability to read Chinese ideograms, which are pictures. You know, Chinese, when they write horse, they don't write the sound. They draw a picture of a horse or any other object, like water. It looks like a splash, and there's a drop coming down, and there are splashes. So this ability to read Chinese and other ideographic languages has given me an ability to really look at things like this, like hieroglyphics. I study Egyptian hieroglyphics as well. And I can look at a thing like this and say to myself, what was President Kennedy thinking when he drew this? Now, obviously, he was thinking about the Earth. He was thinking about space. He's thinking about some things that are coming over North America. Second phase, he wants to know the dollar signs are our secret projects. The blank ones are other unknowns. Then there's the Earth, the man, the trajectory, the boxes, S1, S2, S3, S4, and then the moon. So I look at that, and these boxes are like lozenges, modules in space. And what I concluded was these were the Saturn rockets that were going to take us to the moon, the projects. Right?
I thought that's what you were going to say.
Yeah, obviously, you know, anyone who knows the history of NASA and the space race would be able to put 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 together and come out with Saturn 1, Saturn 2, 3, and 4. Get us to the moon, get us back. But the most intriguing part of that is the sketch of what is overflying the Earth. If I recall correctly, the second picture, the second doodle, where he has marked the U.S. dollar sign, you know, it wasn't exactly a dollar sign. It's part of the oval, but it looks like an S and the uprights, but it's not that explicit. You know what it looks like? If you drew U.S. over it, okay, that's what it was. It kind of like a dollar sign. If the U.S., Uncle Sam, U over S, the hook or the turn in the U is sometimes not seen. That's why it looks like dollar signs. But I recall that in the second doodle, the others are marked somehow with another mark. So it has maybe 5 of ours with the U.S. dollar sign, and then there are maybe 3 with that other sign, and then there are the 3 blanks or the 4 blanks that remain, the unknowns. So I think in that doodle, which he drew in those days, just before he was assassinated, reveals what was on his mind. And I can tell you that on November 12th, 1963, President Kennedy had a hotline conversation with Premier Khrushchev, and one of the subjects that is said to have been discussed was unknowns. Also, November 12th, 1962, I have heard a tape recording of the XCOM meeting in which President Kennedy was discussing the space program with James R. Webb, the head of NASA at that time, was a very important player in this whole thing. He is one of the most powerful men of the 20th century, and he's almost unknown. He is one of the most powerful men of the 20th century because this is the man who held the power of the purse, not the Secretary of the Treasury, but the Director of the Office of Budget and Management, since World War II.
And what was his name again, Robert?
James Webb.
Okay.
They've named the Webb telescope after him.
Okay.
And to hear this tape is remarkable. President Kennedy is the commander-in-chief, and he's telling James Webb that we have a new priority, that we have to get to the moon before the Russians. And James Webb is balking and talking back to the president and saying, no, we have a plan. First we have to master local outer space, and then develop our military capabilities in local space before we can even think of going to the moon. Our budget doesn't have the money to get involved in that at this time, and we have this procedure that we've already stepped out. And President Kennedy says, no, you don't understand. This is the most important scientific project in the history of mankind, and we cannot let the Russians get to the moon before us, because that will prove to the world that communism is a better system than ours, than capitalism, and therefore the world will be turned toward communism. We must get to the moon before the Russians, the Soviets, get there. Webb goes on to a very hard-headed, knuckle-headed, obstinate argument, and he starts to talk down to the president, and he sounds like, pardon the expression, he sounds like an old geezer talking down to a high school kid. At one point, Kennedy becomes so frustrated that he turns to everyone in the room, and he says, does he understand what I'm saying? Or doesn't he understand what I'm saying? And he said, no, we are going to go to the moon. You have to change your plans. And he leaves. Now, when he leaves, the mic stays on, and there's a lot of murmurs and grumbles in the background. And it's a very interesting thing to listen to. It's the November 12, 1962 meeting, President John F. Kennedy XCOM meeting on NASA, the space program, and with James R. Webb. November 12th, 1 year later, he's on the phone talking to Premier Khrushchev. And one of the things that drove the military and James R. Webb in particular up the wall was that these fellows had been fighting communism since World War II and the post-war era and Korea. And then President Kennedy comes along and says, not only do I want to share information and find out from the Russians what they're doing, and we'll tell them what we're doing, but I want you to communicate with the Russian Academy of Sciences through scientific circles and try to establish a joint venture, space cooperation mission to go to the moon together. That was one of his goals.
And how incredible that would have been at that time to be leaked to the public.
10 years ahead of his time.
Yeah, I mean, but,
and Soyuz.
Yeah.
That became the reality. Another thing, and this is where I think that President Kennedy really went overboard. I admire him for many, 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 many things. I'm not an acolyte, a devotee anymore, as I used to be. I really see John F. Kennedy in the light of day, a very good, well-meaning, but flawed human being, just like all the rest of us. The same foibles, some bad habits, but a good heart and a will to help humankind, not just America. His mind was on the greater good, the common weal. So I see his actions as very desperate. He was fighting a one-man war against the CIA and the National Security Agency and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who wanted to prolong the conflict, who wanted to get more deeply involved in Vietnam, precisely because our economy had been retooled. And President Kennedy's father was one of these people who had been in charge of reorganization of the government in 1947 to establish the new Defense Department and separate the Air Force from the Army. So he had seen, since he was a congressman and his father was in the reconstruction of the government, reorganization of the government, he had seen the development of the military-industrial complex firsthand. He had heard President Eisenhower, his predecessor, warning the country about this threat. And I'll tell you, when President Eisenhower gave his briefing to President Kennedy, have no doubt that he warned him about what he had seen already happening in the national security apparatus, which was they were taking over policy. Policy is to be made by the President, the Congress, and executed by the State Department. I'm talking about foreign policy. But he had found out that a renegade group in the CIA had already started to develop their own policy based on anti-communist confrontation, exploitation of the Southeast Asian heroin trade to fund our programs, and that
Robert, let me interrupt you a second, Robert. Can you touch on that just a bit? That's really important about
Vietnam was not just an ideological war.
Right.
The war in Vietnam was to maintain control of the Golden Triangle in Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. That whole area, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, it's called the Golden Triangle, and that's the area from which the best heroin in the world was produced. And this was under the control of the Corsican Mafia and the French. That's why the French were there.
Yeah.
People are very naive, you know. They think that these wars are fought for ideology alone, but the fact is the French, you know, they took their beating at Dien Bien Phu. And if anybody wants to see that beating depicted in very graphic terms, there's a French film made in 1954, which is called Jump into Hell. Take a look at that movie. That movie foreshadowed Vietnam. That movie told everyone what was coming to anyone who got involved in a land war in Vietnam. But it was ignored. Why? Because our economy had been re-engineered to operate in a state of perpetual war.
Right.
That's why we have executive orders. Executive orders came into being in World War II as a result of the War Powers Act. And the war powers invest the president with this authority. But in reality, let me tell you, it's a highfalutin name for nothing, but people fall for it. I heard Newt Gingrich define and describe what an executive order is. And he said, an executive order is nothing other than a memo from the president to the executive branch of government. It has no binding authority on anyone else, on the Congress, on the citizenry, or any other department of government. Now, how can he keep executing executive orders with no wars going on? So in the interim between wars, we would have things like the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on women. Sorry to be so sarcastic, but they will go to such lengths to just have that word in something that validates the continued application and implementation of quote-unquote executive orders. So let's get back to Kennedy and this monumental thing that happened.
Yeah, let me ask you this, Robert.
Which is the topic about which we were talking.
Yeah, before you go any further, I want to read you something, and I'm sort of recapping what you said I've heard you say before.
Okay.
That before Kennedy died, he had printed millions of dollars from the U.S. Treasury as opposed to the Federal Reserve. He basically tried to revamp the CIA. He ordered everything UFO-related to be put on his desk. He basically probably was going to pull us out of Vietnam or never really get involved to the extent that Johnson did, and that's probably an understatement.
Well, that executive order had already gone out.
Okay.
To withdraw at least 1,000 troops by December and to plan a stage withdrawal in 1964.
Okay. And he also wanted a joint U.S.-Soviet mission to the moon. Now, with all of this stuff that we're talking about, and Lordy, that's enough to to certainly upset the apple cart. Let's talk about going to the assassination and talk about who might be at the very top of this, pulling all the strings.
Well, the rat was Lyndon Johnson, and there's no doubt about that now.
He was the chief rat.
He was the chief rat, along with that renegade group of policymakers in the Central Intelligence Agency, who all had a gripe against President Kennedy. The information that I'm going to give you now is from the deathbed confession of E. Howard Hunt.
I was going to bring that up. I'm glad you are.
This is not Robert Morningstar making up this. I knew and I predicted in the early 1990s that as time went on and old age encroached upon these people, these witnesses, these participants, that the weight of conscience would weigh very, very heavily, come crushing down on them before their end, which they would see. They would know. Everyone knows when death is coming in terms of old age. And I knew that people would start confessing, just to die with a clean conscience. And E. Howard Hunt was one of those people. E. Howard Hunt was in the midst of the whole thing, from the Bay of Pigs, through the JFK assassination, through the Watergate scandal. And on his deathbed, he told his son, and you can hear this on YouTube. St. John Hunt has put this out for the world. He's written a marvelous book. And E. Howard Hunt said, Lyndon Johnson was the mastermind. He worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. The head of MK-Ultra was Cord Meyer. MK-Ultra was the mind control program initiated by the CIA in the 1950s. It had many names. It molted from Project Artichoke to Project Bluebird to Project Naomi to MK-Ultra and so on. And the mastermind, the director, was Cord Meyer, an enemy of President Kennedy since after World War II, due to this conflict between WASPs and Catholics in the Ivy Leagues. They hated each other since college and World War II. Cord Meyer had been a war hero in the Pacific. He had lost an eye, and he wore a false eyeball. Kennedy had affairs with his wife before and after they were married, and they despised each other. Class warfare in the Northeast establishment. He saw Kennedy as a social climber who was trying to be accepted by the WASP elite. So, in the midst of this, Kennedy starts to object to the way the CIA is starting to make policy and not getting approval, and he finds out about the black projects being funded by criminal activity. The CIA had been in league or had an alliance with the mafia since World War II, since they helped us take over Sicily, preparing the way for Patton and his armies. And in the aftermath of Patton's conquest, mafia leaders were installed in Sicilian towns as mayors and police departments heads, rather than let communists take over. Be that as it may, the relationship continued and was applied in the post-war era as the mafia was used to eliminate leftist leaders, undesirables, in France, Italy, and Greece, which came very close to being toppled by communist socialist movements. So we get now to Castro and Castro's break with the United States. When Castro broke with the United States and went with the communists, our partners were alerted that the United States government would look favorably upon Castro being dispatched as soon as possible.
Our partners being the mafia?
The mafia, of course.
Okay.
They were hired men, and they were protected. Their relation. It was the top secret. This is one of the biggest secrets of the Kennedy assassination, that they could not take the lid off this fact that Jack Ruby, a made mafia member, had been involved in gun running to Castro when he was on our side. Since 1957, Jack Ruby and a man named Thomas Eli Davis had been running guns to the Cuban revolutionaries. And then Castro turned, and yet, even after Castro turned, we now know that Jack Ruby made a trip to Cuba in late 1959, before we really cut off all travel. He made a trip down there. And so he is intimately involved in this gun-running operation, because in the gun-running, when Castro turned, he still was involved in the gun-running, as he now supplied guns to the anti-Castro faction that was working up to do the Bay of Pigs. So this mafia connection is a very important one. And it was the biggest secret around the Kennedy assassination, because some of the mechanics, those are the guys I call the guys with the rifles in Dealey Plaza, the rifles and the pistol, the mechanics were mafia. They used three different groups, each of which could be written off, each of which, if they had been caught, could have been explained away or framed if they were caught. And at the same time, 2 or 3 patsies were being held in the wings.
Okay, now, Robert, let me ask, so we have the limousine in Dealey Plaza, it's going down, and you've got 3 or 4 elements out here, well, one behind the grassy knoll. I mean, what are we talking about?
I'll tell you where they were.
Okay.
They had a fake sniper's nest up in the Texas School Book Depository. This was to frame Oswald, because no one from that window could have hit President Kennedy with a rifle from the distance when he finally came clear. If you've ever been to the Texas School Book Depository and had the opportunity to go to that window and look down, you would see that at the turn of at Elm Street, as you look down, a huge oak tree was down there in 1963. And as the car passed under that area, the oak tree is right basically under the window in front of the entrance, and that tree and its branches would obstruct any view of the president until he was well down the road by the street sign, which is a very long shot for anyone. And really, no one has ever been able to duplicate that shot, no matter how they try to rig those Australian TV documentaries.
Yeah, I saw Governor Jesse Ventura try.
Here it is. They had 2 guys up there.
Yeah.
There was one in the southeast window and one in the southwest window. I've seen the picture of the guy lurking in the southwest window, which was cut out from the Time magazine, 1963. It came out with the edition right after Kennedy assassination, and they had a double page, a page and a half picture. It overlapped a page and half a page. And I looked at it, a strange picture, They cut out a part of the building. And I'm 15 years old, Like you're 13, I'm 15. I looked at the pictures. This is a weird picture, They cut out the left side of the building. And then I went on. Years and years later, I found a copy of the picture, the original, and it showed the left side of the building and that southwest window. And a man named Robert Groden, who had access to a lot of this material very early on in the 70s, he took that and he enlarged and enhanced, not digitally but optically in a dark room, and found a face in that window, lurking in that window. And there were enough characteristics in the face and the ear, the jaw, the angles of the brow, and the slope of the nose for me to see, wow, that guy's Frenchie. Frenchie, the guy who was in the tramp pictures, the guy who was walking in the front of the lead when they were arresting the tramps. There's this famous set of pictures called the tramp photos. Look around for them. All you have to do is Google tramp photos, JFK tramp photos. You'll see the guy in the lead, French-looking. This guy's in the window. So, but the killers, the real killers, one was in the Daltex building in an office, an empty office that was below Zapruder's office, facing straight down Elm Street. This would have been the guy that had direct shot in the back and did hit President Kennedy in the back. President Kennedy's first wound was between the shoulder blades at a descending angle of about 40 degrees. So says the Warren Commission report. Now, this bullet entered his back, and President Kennedy, who was a World War II survivor and had been in big battles in Guadalcanal, just see PT-109, you'll see what he went through, the firefights he survived. Instantly, he yelled out, "Oh my God, I've been shot!" When the Warren Commission heard this from the Secret Service men, Kellerman and Greer, our inspector said, no, that's not possible. President Kennedy could not have said anything because the first shot was in the throat, and that shattered his larynx. He couldn't have said anything. And Kellerman replies, "No, it was President Kennedy. We heard his voice." And Greer said the same thing. "No, it's President Kennedy." And he tries to deride their testimony and say they're absolutely wrong. And they said, finally he says, "How can you be so sure?" And they said, he said it in a Boston accent. And that shut down the conversation there. So, the sequence of shots has been given to us wrongly because our inspector made up a fairy tale to try to force his theory, force the facts to fit his theory. This is called forcing something true.
Our inspector from Pennsylvania, the
yes,
Republican who really...
Pennsylvania was a counsel for the Warren Commission.
Right, yeah.
He is the man, he's the only man in the Warren Commission to have seen the JFK autopsy photographs.
Why?
No one else on the commission.
Why was he the only one?
Well, he was in charge of the investigation and the autopsy-related aspect of it. Each counsel had something special to study. Chief Justice Earl Warren opened up the pictures, looked at them, put them back in, and he didn't even want to see them, and delegated Spector to be the man in charge of this autopsy part, because the discrepancy occurred immediately. Dr. Malcolm Perry, who was the surgeon who attended President Kennedy, removed the necktie and saw a tiny hole about the size of your pinky, maybe a .22 caliber bullet, a very small caliber. I knew Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who wrote Conspiracy of Silence, and he told me, and he showed me in Chicago. He showed me his finger, pinky. He said, "You see that? The first phalange, the first knuckle?" He said, "You see that? That's how small that hole was." And he said, Dr. Perry was an artist. What you see in those photographs of the autopsy is the work of a butcher. Okay? Now, I'm going to explain to you why this butchery was necessary in a second. Because I'll tell you right now, the man in the JFK autopsy photographs is not President Kennedy.
Oh, man.
Wow.
We have to stop.
That is part one of that interview, and
amazing.
We don't want to stop. We want to keep listening.
Amazing. Wow.
I'm looking at my two co-hosts here, and we don't know what to say.
The hair on my arms is sticking straight up.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
I've always believed that this was a conspiracy. Always. Never for a minute did I think that Lee Harvey had the
wherewithal,
whatever, to do all that. This is fascinating.
And since both of us have been at Dealey Plaza, I mean, that always was fascinating to me. You know, watching the Zapruder film years ago. I was there, I guess, in '98 or something like that. It was the first time I went down to Dallas, and I went into the actual building, and then watched the Zapruder film, and watched that link, and then I started reading more about Zapruder, and we'll get to that later. But everything in this is so fascinating. This guy is amazing. I love this.
He is. You know, as you know, I've been kind of very interested in this for years and years, and heard a lot of different interviews, and one of which, or many times I've heard about E. Howard Hunt on his deathbed, saying that he was part of this whole thing. He said it was called the Big Event, and he was actually on the second team, not the first team, but the second team. And he was housed in some small little, like those temporary apartments you have on the outside of the city, and he was kind of waiting for his call, but the first team got the job done, so he wasn't in there. But he talks about this whole thing, and it's extremely interesting, and you got to wonder why a guy would do that if he wasn't guilty at that point, because so his son kind of carries that banner and tells the story. But if you look at this guy's history, really has to be kind of rewritten. This is not the history that we were presented at all, is it?
Oh, it's intentional, of course, because Kennedy wanted peace. He was in favor of human rights. A lot of people, even including myself, until I heard some of what this interview had to say, always felt like he was pushing for civil rights, the civil rights movement, and he was pushing a little too fast for some people, and maybe that was the reason that he was taken out. But now, when you hear all about the economy of war and the fact that this country doesn't survive well economically when we're not at war.
Right.
Yeah, and if you go back to our first guest, Ed Galloway, and then you listen to Robert Stanley, and you listen to Robert Morningstar, this whole big picture begins to kind of come together, where you've got this secret group of people in the world running things. Military-industrial complex is becoming so strong that it's actually taking over things. Underneath, you can't see it, but it's happening. And this covert money, this drug money and stuff goes in to fund this, and they've got their own little technology going and their own little science fair going, and the rest of us are kind of back in the Stone Age.
Well, just to back up to the beginning of this whole interview, which I thought was fascinating, when he was talking about what was happening during the time that we were talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the fact is that a lot of this was predicated on the fact that there were all of these unknowns that were coming into the country, and they thought that they were coming in through Canada and everything else, that this was something coming from Russia, when indeed what this were what we now call UFOs or alien spaces.
Yeah, fast walkers is what they call
the fast walkers. And I find that fascinating because none of that stuff was available readily to most of the masses, and the fact that he builds the case for all of the things that Kennedy was doing and Khrushchev was doing as well at that time.
Yeah.
Because they were trying to be able to.
But you see, Kennedy doodles. And he has,
that's what I'm talking about,
and he has the circles and the dollar signs on some and the circles. What he's got is some of these fast walkers were ours. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Some of these are ours.
Yeah. Well, or they were something that we had put up in space to begin with that were either satellites or spy-type things that were up there, that were already put up there, and that were already circling the Earth, that was up there watching us. I mean, Big Brother, obviously, he knew at that point that Big Brother had already established itself in space, but where we were at that point and who was behind it, that's why with the unknowns, I mean, that's where it's fascinating, because obviously, and especially with the rat Johnson.
All that depends on how much, though, Mary, that Kennedy knew. Because when you say these were satellites and stuff, if you believe what a lot of people believe, there was a secret space program already in progress at that point. So is he doodling to say this is part of the secret space program, or these are satellites, and then these are fast walkers?
Or maybe he was doodling his legacy because he wanted to get to the moon. He never lived to see it. Right. But it happened for the end of the decade, like he projected. And the thing about it that Robert Morningstar said that's absolutely true, and we can't discount it enough, and that is the naivete of the American public.
Exactly.
We really have no clue as a group of folks who kind of just go through the hustle bustle of our day. We don't have any idea of some of the stuff that's going on in the underbelly of our government.
La, 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 I don't want to hear it. Nah, 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 I'm not hearing it.
Quit acting like liberals and come to the phone.
Yeah, if I put my hands over my ears and I keep my eyes closed, then I won't be able to have to worry about it.
Well, conservative, liberal alike, we're all very naive when it comes to that. But, how will you know? I mean, if you have these alphabet organizations that have complete control, complete secrecy, the funding is even... You're not even allowed to really question too much about the funding. And if you believe what a lot of people... Remember, what was Marion, this is something I saw that you just about flipped out about, when he was talking about the Golden Triangle. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, because... and we were listening to this earlier, because for me, it absolutely positively confirmed for me. With the Golden Triangle, we all know that was the bed of heroin, and that's where the control of the American public began, because that's the way I look at it, because that's what happened is that when heroin became and where was it fed? It was fed to Americans. And we are the most addicted nation on this earth. America is the most addicted nation. And I think that that was intent. There was a reason for it. It had to do with control. It had to do with control of the minds of American people. And I think that is an overall. And when I heard about the Golden Triangle, I mean, that's just been planted in my head because.
But what percentage of the American public was taking heroin? Now think about this now. If you think about it in another way, control is the money made from the heroin.
Exactly, because of that was going to feed the military complex. We knew that. Okay. But here's that I understand. But here's the thing. But the control of the mindset of Americans and how they ended up developing that, and how it came to pass was by getting us entrenched in Vietnam. Which is one thing that we know that Johnson did, because he just absolutely, Kennedy got us there, but Johnson put us full bore into Vietnam in a way that was absolutely criminal. He should have been brought up for war crimes for what he did to this public, but because there was no reason for us to be there. But the boys that came home from Vietnam that were addicted, and then they brought that into this country because that's where the culture of heroin became so prevalent, was after the guys came back from Vietnam. A lot of that came here because of that. And it wasn't readily available in the States before that. There was some of it, a lot of it, and it was in Hollywood. But it really became readily available after Vietnam. And I think that's also control of a society. What segment of the population of the United States became most controlled? It was the black segment that became very controlled by the heroin population. And that has a lot to do with the mafia, control of people, and controlling of minds, and destroying America at its core. Because if you get to the people and you control them at the root, then you can determine, and they can later become controlled, which, as you see the evolution of this country.
Listen, let me interject something here. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but here, I don't believe the government as a whole sets out to destroy its people, okay? I believe the government wants to control all the money. And if you control all the money, you control all the people. I believe that John F. Kennedy started out his presidency as a very naive, hardworking, like Morningstar said, good heart, wants to further humanity. And then you get into the presidency and you start to realize what you've gotten yourself into. You've always heard, oh, look at the president. Here's a photo of him before he became president. Now here's a picture of him 2 years in, and now here's a photo of him when he gets out of office at either the 4 or 8 year mark, and look how much he's aged. Look how much he's found out. Yep. And Jack, he can't really do anything about it, Ed.
That's well said.
That's
okay,
exactly
I want to tell you something I heard one time, and it was on a talk show, and it probably was on Coast to Coast AM. But one of the guests was talking about when somebody becomes president of the United States, what happens? And he says, nobody knows for sure, but let's say that people walk in and say, now this is what we want you to do, and this is where we're going. And if you have any real questions, we'll show you a couple different angles of the Zapruder film.
Well, I wouldn't doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it because I think that it's like we were talking about. The Manchurian Candidate was well established by the time that Kennedy was put in place because I think that Johnson was the perfect Manchurian Candidate. I think that he was absolutely tailor-made by the industrial complex, military-industrial complex, to be able to run this country and all of the other subcultures that were running the country at the time, because he definitely fit right in, and he was in lockstep with all of those plans. This is just an amazing.
But Ed, let me ask you this, and I know you read a lot on this subject. We're not the first people to sit around a microphone and say these things, okay? I mean, this kind of conversation has been going on since the assassination. Movies have been made about this particular topic, yet the conversations continue with no resolution. Why is that, in your mind? Evidence has been completely
I think it goes
hidden?
back again to the press. I think that in order to get this out, I mean, I'll tell you where I get my information. It's certainly not on CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, or the Fox. It's on shows like Coast to Coast AM. It's when I research interviews on the internet or try to buy books that I've heard about and read, because that's where I get the information. I don't know where else you get it. I mean, how many talk shows actually, this, I will tell you that we have two more parts of this interview with Robert Morningstar, and it gets a little more intense even than it
That was pretty intense, what we just heard.
Yeah, and he left us hanging. But think about Hunt's final deathbed discussion, too, that he had with his son. The fact is that he was very willing at that point to talk about how corrupt and how bad it was. And yet that was never really brought to light to the public because, although it's been said, it's, like you said, it's been squashed by the media. No one jumped on top of that and started raising red flags going, hey.
Well, I'll tell you where you got it. You got it if you watched Jesse Ventura's Conspiracy Theory. Now, he did a show on that.
Well, people want to, poo-poo Jesse Ventura, but I have to tell you, he's my hero. I like Jesse.
I tell you what,
he might be a little off.
He's very intelligent. Yeah. Don't think for a second that, he's a big dumb wrestler, because he's not.
No, not only is he not dumb, he knows very well that his life is in danger by doing what he's doing.
Let me tell you, brother.
Yeah, tell me. Yeah,
they did it.
Yep. But he does. He knows his life is in danger.
I want to ask you one question. I was governor.
Just one.
I was governor. We only have a minute or two left here. And by the way, wouldn't it be fun to get Jesse on the show one time?
Yeah, we'll do that. I think we can. I think it'd be great.
That would maybe take more than I think he lives in Mexico. No, I mean, I'm seriously. I think he does live in Mexico. Have. We only have a minute or two left, but we could go as long as we want. But let's say this: that what did we learn in this part one of the interview? We learned that there were a lot of things concerning and around the presidency of John Kennedy that put him in peril. The fact that he wanted the UFO files on his desk, the fact that he printed money on the United States Treasury as opposed to the Federal Reserve.
Absolutely.
And to me, that is a big thing.
And Arlen Specter is a very bad dude, man.
Yeah, but
very bad dude.
Also, he was going to get us out of Vietnam.
Allegedly a very bad dude. Okay, come on.
You have to use that word, don't you?
No.
Legally?
No, he's not a
okay.
He's a public figure. I think we can trash him as much as we want to.
I think Arlen Specter always sounded like Jesse Helms to me a little bit, except he didn't have quite the country, And Pennsylvania is moving in that direction. And,
Yeah, I think that the thing is he was willing to cover all that stuff up. I mean, and the fact is that he's the only person that saw those photos on the Warren Commission. I remember very well when the Warren Commission first came out, and they had the first reports on that, and everybody's going, "Oh yeah, there was just one shooter. There's nobody in Grassy Knoll."
Somebody else on that Warren Commission by the name of Gerald Ford.
That's right. And I believe that when JFK got into power, he was so idealistic, he believed he could overcome all the control.
Actually, he believed he was
president. That's what we always talked about, is that he is the last man.
He believed he was president.
And felt that he had the power to make the changes. And his heart was in the right place, but he just, he was not what they wanted. in that particular seat at that particular time.
Well,
they had Johnson ready to go. They knew that.
Oh yeah, they launched him on purpose that way.
Yeah.
But the fascinating thing about all this is, and we're also talking about things like the executive orders, and we all get crazy if you go back, and if anybody that hasn't done this yet, if you're listening to this, you probably already have. But if you were to go back and start reading some of the executive orders, I thought what was interesting was when they have the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the war on, to be able to utilize the word war, WAR, and to tie that in and to throw that in there so that somehow it would become more important, because executive orders was only supposed to be
in time of war.
Well, yeah, in time of war, and it was supposed to be an order that would go to the executive branch but wasn't supposed to affect the American people, and that to me blows my mind.
Mary, how do you feel about that exactly?
Her mind is blown.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've got to go have some coffee right now.
There's some all over me.
Oh dear. Oh, I hate it when that happens. Oh, icky.
You guys never commented on Robert Morningstar's final thing when he said the body.
Oh no, because we're both sitting here
we're
like,
waiting until part 2
we're waiting
for that,
for part 2. We can't stand it.
Don't you wonder who that was? If it wasn't John Kennedy, who was it?
I don't think it matters.
I don't think it does.
Could have been anybody.
Yeah, it's a plant.
Okay.
It's a plant. We'll figure it out in the next.
And Jack Ruby took out Oswald. That was part of the plan.
Oh, yeah,
that was not some.
Too.
That was not some panic.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they forgot to tell Oswald that though.
Minor detail.
No.
Yeah, minor detail.
All right, Robert
Amazing.
Morningstar comes back for part 2 and part 3. What in the world's going on? I'm Ed Galloway from Mary London. Jack Daniels saying goodbye, and we'll see you next time.